So first, what do we mean by social innovations? By social innovation, so we refer to new social practices, models, designs, products to address social needs. And what you guys are talking about could well be something that would fall under the theme of social innovation. But the idea really is to look at micro areas in, for instance, working conditions, and also general practices, education, health, community development, environment as being driven by social issues. So we have pressure points, for instance, in participation of civil society. We look at activism, policy influence, intervention via microfinancing, what you guys are doing, incentives, you look at social rules and the like. So if you look at, initially Elmer was saying we should be talking about university response. And so I looked at UP and compared with Ateneo, LaSalle, at least the big ones. At least what we can gather from, and this method is very arbitrary. I have no time to interview people. So UP has a unified response to COVID. And you see there an approach that's very much clinical and epidemiological, of course. And there's this discussion about development of toolkits, diagnostics. Our engineering college has some colleagues developing sanitation contraptions and the like. But I guess there are far more complex issues out there that need to be addressed. So if you look at the pains, when we talk about the COVID crisis, we probably would be asking the question, what is uniquely COVID? What's unique about this crisis? Probably has to do with the scale and the rate of infection. This has been a tenacious virus. There is social isolation, which is not really unique, but maybe the scale also. The complexity and unpredictability of the disease. There are hopes of a vaccine or vaccines. Russia is coming in, China, US, but then there's also the reality check that it may not last, and you will not be solely depending on vaccines as the sole solution. But more importantly, in the ground, the COVID crisis has amplified the existing prevailing social and economic inequalities. And these are pains that inform our actions when we do, our work. So looking at the macro picture, there are all sorts of factors that we need to consider: demographic, of course, geographic, and increasingly governance. Why is Pasig doing better than Quezon City, for instance, at least in the perception of the public? If you look at demographics in terms of ages, for instance, this is very much a worldwide phenomenon. These are confirmed cases by age group. But then those who get infected do not necessarily die. It's your nanas, your lolas, lolo who are dying disproportionately in terms of age groups. And so there could also be a gender problem, but not as much as pronounced here. No, as you can see, the difference may not be really that significant. There could be about cities. It could be about governance in these different cities. As I said, these are questions that we need to be addressing as social scientists, as community development workers, as economists. We need to look at what's so special about Navotas that they become number one, or maybe Cebu, San Juan, and so on, in terms of per million cases, population cases. We can look at Quezon City as well. The new infection rates. You just don't. Yeah, okay. There's a title on top. Manila, you have a surge there as well. So this could be, there could be patterns there, and so the idea that we should have a data sharing framework. I've been in and out doing some e-health work, and this has been a problem for decades already. I find it funny that the DOH, for instance, we're still having problems distinguishing De La Cruz that is joint versus De La Cruz that is set apart, and so that is bungling their information system. So this was a problem all the way back to the 1970s, but you'll be amazed how tenacious the digital problem is. So if you've got data sharing framework there, the privacy framework, please share with us, because we'll see how it can really be adopted, because that is at the kernel of the problem when we try to understand, to have a precise definition of the problems in Quezon City, Manila, or Navotas, or elsewhere. So you can also look at micro and more sociological, organizational pains. This is something that the Americans are concerned about. We're not necessarily seeing this pattern in the Philippines, but there's a divorce is not yet in effect in the Philippines, but it will be interesting to see how many divorces we'll have in light of COVID. No? And then we'll see how much of this divorce is driving poverty, at least in the Western country, it's US anyway. It's a significant driver of poverty. We now look at income and social safety net. This is a liberal framework that we're supposed to be maximizing the lot of the minimally advantaged. At least that's what we consider as an advocacy for what we do in the social and environment college. No? So we're looking at income and wage as social safety net, as something sustainable, not just a buloy. So I'm interested to see data on SAP 7.3, and if this is something that can be reframed in a more long-term manner, sustainable manner. But as an added dimension, maybe in the discussion, we see income not just about money. And we have some work from our psychology department, social psychologist, Dr. Lina Lee Sisip, and recently Ton Clemente, looking at wages as a good starting point to improve the quality of life, the well-being. So we have developed a framework, for instance, of what might count as magandang buhay, because while we are talking about COVID as a challenge in survival, we hope to see past survival and really about thriving, about flourishing as human lives as Filipinos. And so I will not be discussing this. I won't have, I cannot do justice to the work of my colleagues. This has been a data-driven kind of formulation. So I leave this to you. But the idea is that there is more to income than just money. So if you look at fairness as a metric in the pursuit of social action, for instance, of interventions, whether central bank or other parts of government, we're looking at impact on well-being and resilience. How much of the wage or income would really be a predictor of resilience? The empirics has yet to follow, to really be seen concretely, at least in local studies. It is something that may determine your capability, your capacity to respond to shocks, to crisis, because whether it's COVID or a storm or some other typhoons or some other mass crisis, possibly the big one, earthquake for Metro Manila, you will see income as a predictor. Income, not just money, but income as a total package. So we're looking at microfinancing solutions, for instance, that isn't just about survival, but about, as I said, capacity to flourish. So this has been articulated elsewhere. Some people, some colleagues would say this is so first world, so Scandinavian, but I think it doesn't have to be exclusively first world. So when we speak of microfinancing solution, it isn't just about loans, but really something that it's really in support of universal basic income. So if you're looking at credit systems, it need not be about some dole out, but it could be something that is convertible to food. We see that maybe we can do something about the pagpag market, credits for water, electricity, and so digital payments would have to be integrated into these systems. And this is something that would require really some serious look at our data data sharing practices. No? It will be about fair contributions. Many of our people of the poor have volunteered to do sanitation. Maybe they can also be tapped to look at recycling programs. We have so much plastic in the country. We have a problem of recycling, and then for many other countries in the world. But more specifically, we're looking at a model where collection of plastic can be monetized or can be factored into this credit system. So people are moving to Lazada, to Shopee, to online shopping. But if you haven't noticed, it just produced tremendous amount of plastic. So much deliveries involved over packaging with just too much plastic there. Could be other contributions to wildlife conservation, volunteer work, and all these can be factored as part of a credit system. So there are related challenges to these solutions. One solution would present attendant problems or challenges. The digital ID system is not yet in place and might be coming in rather too little too late. I understand that this is being pursued. An authentication problem related to that, of course. Fund transfer, you said that PS mentioned about SAP as new digital accounts. Are they related to the banking system? I saw your report. Majority of Filipinos remain unbanked. So we'll see some news maybe from you guys how this is going to be carried out in a massive scale, no, and not just some pilots. No, I'm under the thought, from the late Dornila that while it's fine and dandy to be doing all these disparate pilot studies, but unless you really have to scale this and scale it quickly and make big mistakes, real mistakes, it's not going to create any dent in the problems we're going to solve. So the microfinancing could also be tied to access to information. While you allow people to have some access to cash, to some capital, or probably supporting some kind of universal income in exchange for their volunteer work, among others. So unless you couple that with access to knowledge, so there is a problem again of last mile connectivity, and there are some technical solutions there. For instance, we can apportion certain part of the credit, for instance, for access to certain knowledge sites. For instance, the telcos can well be made to do this as some kind of an X deal with government. All they have to do is really tweak the SSIDs in their Wi-Fi's. We have Wi-Fi's already all over run by telcos. And so it doesn't have to be exclusive, because the idea of some people is that you should have a government platform. That may take time. No? So the last mile problem has to be solved fast. The other aspect has to do with the 4Ps. You already have a platform. There are many challenges with 4Ps, but it can be a starting point for more interventions. There are certain outcomes that are being addressed by 4Ps, but access to information is not one of these metrics being addressed. The data could be cleaned well. There are many more. There are 4Ps beneficiaries who are no longer qualified actually, but they continue to receive money. 4Ps has been the program has been there's a significant challenge there for people loaning their credit card and their bank accounts, and having debts way ahead of the actual release of money. So this area, but then the idea is that it has to be expanded and transformed as a platform. I'm looking at SAP now, thanks to Pia's information, or the information from Pia, but we'll see how this can really be transformed. Unless we put this in a form that many more people, maybe academic researchers, can analyze and can access in a meaningful way the solutions from central bank and from other civil society actors would remain siloed. No, it has to be some kind of a crowdsourcing that would enable us to look at these data sets more closely. So as I said, universal basic income is a good starting point for these things. So to end my presentation, I will just introduce this innovation curve or arc, whatever that is, what I should look to you. So when you do social innovation, you look at the level of satisfaction, and the idea, of course, is when you innovate, it's supposed to meet certain needs, social needs, whether it's going to be a product, a process, model, design. You want to tweak the market, but then it has to reach a certain level of efficiency for you to be able to capture the value of that. There has to be some inflection point. This is just from the point of view of the slide. It's so much messier out there. But then unless you see social participation and people being capacitated. And the last aspect I'm going to introduce is really the trust infrastructure that we're developing conceptually and more also support of empirics. And if you look at the literature in this, for instance, the work of Honora O'Neill in the UK, she would love to pit this against the so-called transparency culto ng transparency. And we see government agencies putting all these transparency seals, but it doesn't have a dent on the level of trust of people in government and in other institutions. People continue to doubt what we really can do. Of course, this is not to say that it's entirely government's fault, but people do not become less mistrustful of institutions just because there is more information to be released. Okay, I'm not saying that that transparency is bad, but it has to be coupled with a kind of trust infrastructure that people are willing to really invest in emotionally to be able to really put in their share in transformation of or the solution of problems. So this is it for me. We are from the Social Innovations Lab. We're only building, but we hope to be able to contribute in our own little ways to address serious problems. Thank you very much.